background, some background as far as what led to the book is I discovered the Emmett Till case just by accident in 1994. And it's because I was watching a video about the civil rights movement, and the first 15 minutes of that video were about the Emmett Till case. So that was my introduction in the fall of 1994. Video is called Eyes on the Prize. It's a history of the civil rights movement. When I learned about it, I couldn't get it out of my mind. I watched about how Emmett had been, what he was accused of doing, that he was kidnapped, and that he was brutally murdered. And they showed the photo of Emmett's face on that video, and I could not get that out of my mind. And then when I saw that the men were acquitted for the murder and sold their story and profited off it, I was just very angry, and I had to find out what happened to them. I had to find out what happened to Emmett's mother because I'd never heard of any of them. So I didn't know if they were still living, or what happened to them. So this journey began that night I saw that video, and that case never let me go after that. It was just a part of my life that was just steady from that moment on. Things really changed 2 years later when I interviewed Emmett's mother over the phone for a class project, because she was so personable, and we became friends after that and regularly talked on the phone and for the next 6 years until she died. So the case went from a historical event to a personal one for me, because I had come to know her and the most important person to the story. And so that changed everything and made it more personal. Then when she died in 2003, it was about a year and a half later that the federal government reopened the case and decided to look further to see if there were people involved that were still living. So at that point, I decided it was time that I really wrote the book I always wanted to read on the subject. I like reading histories that are very detailed, that try to tell the whole story, that work out contradictions and things like that, that some people may carelessly insert into the story. I wanted it to be accurate, I wanted it to be comprehensive, and I wanted it to be a place where people could read and answer most, if not all, of their questions. So that took from 2004 to 2014 to write the book. Took several trips to Mississippi, 4 or 5 trips to Chicago, and then the University of Press published it in August of 2015 in time for the 60th anniversary of the case. So that's really what led to writing the book. And here's, I guess everybody, I'm not sure if you've read it, or this springboards a discussion to read it later, or how your book club works, but this is the book, and it's in a paperback edition now. It was printed in hardback in 2015. Had a chance to make a few corrections, and this latest version has a new preface by me. And so the book itself, because I had done so much research in the South, this included several interviews with people who are still living. And when I started working on the book, there are a lot of people living then that aren't alive today. Several journalists. One of the key witnesses to the hearing the murder take place, Willie Reed, he was alive, and I interviewed him. Emmett Till's cousin, who was in the bed with him, Simeon Wright, was still living. And of course, I recorded an interview with his mother, Mamie Till Mobley, back before I thought I would write a book. And so I had all these interviews, and I did a lot of archival research and that. And so if you've looked at the book, if you look at the footnotes, you'll see it's very well researched. And in the notes itself, I try to sort through any contradictions. The biggest contradiction, the biggest myth related to the story is what happened in the store, in the Bryant grocery store. So as we know, Emmett Till was a 14-year-old African-American teenager from Chicago who went to visit family in Mississippi for the last 2 weeks of his summer vacation in 1955. And There's no dispute that he went into a store, the Bryant Grocery and Meat Market, with some cousins. They drove, noticed a checker game playing outside, and they stopped to watch this game. And then a few of the kids that came with Emmett went into the store to buy some candy or whatever. Then Emmett Till went in and bought some bubble gum. And while he was in the store, for a few moments at least, he was alone with Carolyn Bryant. And when he left the store, she followed him out, and he waved and said goodbye to her. And then she got upset and went towards the car for what she said, and everybody assumed was to get a pistol. And then as she was walking towards the car, Emmett Till wolf whistled at her. And that led 3 days later to the woman's husband and half brother come along, enter Moses Wright's home, Emmett's uncle, kidnap him, and then of course take him out and murder him. Now, for me, I had to focus a lot on what happened in the store, and especially if in the last couple of days, not sure if you've seen the news, but the FBI had reopened the case in 2017, and they just closed it yesterday. Did you all see that news about that?
No, I missed that piece.
Okay. Well, they closed it because they couldn't.
Yes, I saw that piece.
Okay. Well, they closed it because they couldn't determine if Carolyn Bryant was lying or not about what happened inside the store. What happened outside happened in front of several witnesses, so that's pretty well established, even though sometimes people try to dispute whether Emmett whistled or not. There's really no disputing that if you look at what his cousins said at the time, what they've said today. But what happened inside is an interesting one. During my research, not long before I was writing the book, some papers became available from the author William Bradford Huey, who received the papers that had been kept by the defense attorneys in this case. One of those papers had a statement from Carolyn Bryant issued 2 days after the murder, or at least 2 days after the body was discovered and her husband was in jail. In this statement, she gives a very mild account of what happened in the store. On the witness stand 20 days later, she has this elaborate story that Emmett grabbed her, propositioned her, jumped behind the candy counter, and told her he'd been with white women before. She turned it into a sexual assault, or an attempted one. So it's clear that she embellished her story from the time she first told the defense attorneys until the time that she went on the witness stand 20 days later. And so in 2017, author Tim Tyson, who did interview her in 2008, it's like the only interview she's ever granted outside of the FBI when they came calling in 2004. Tim Tyson claimed that Carolyn Bryant admitted to him that she made that up. And that created a lot of buzz in the United States and everywhere about the case, because here was a alleged confession by her that she lied about Emmett Till grabbing her and all of that kind of stuff. Well, the FBI looked into that because they thought if she admitted to lying, maybe she's got more to say. But in their investigation, they discovered that there was no evidence that she actually made this admission to this guy, to Tim Tyson. He recorded his interview with her, but he didn't record that portion, he said. If you're a historian and you get a bombshell like that from somebody, you're going to ask them to repeat it. Turn on your tape recorder and repeat it. He didn't do that for whatever reason. And now she's saying she never did recant. And so because they couldn't prove it, because Tim Tyson gave contradictory stories, because he didn't have it recorded, and because she's saying she never said it, the FBI closed its investigation, saying that they really couldn't do any more with that. So here's the thing that's confusing, is that she did lie, but we don't have to rely on Tim Tyson to say to understand that she lied. We just have to compare her statements that she made to the attorneys and on the witness stand in 1955. And so there's different layers to this confession and to the whole story. The whole Emmett Till case has, the facts behind it have been muddied several times because of misinformation that comes out, and it leads people, it confuses people, and they get kind of going in the wrong direction, believing certain myths and things like that. And then it's been really hard to correct those myths. I thought I had a bunch to correct just in my book, but since the book's come out, there have been so many more, like this alleged confession and all of that. And so it's just been a case where facts, despite how stubborn facts are, they seem to get buried so often in this case. And so, you know, that's kind of what, that was the whole purpose of my book. And when I started researching the book in 2004, as I said, it was after the FBI began their new investigation into the case. And I knew that the story was going to have an ending that I didn't quite yet know what it was going to be. And so that's one of the reasons I decided then to write the book, because I knew that the results of the investigation would give me something to write about that nobody else had written about. And during the course of that investigation, they found the trial transcript that had been missing for decades. So I was the first one really that had the chance to take that transcript, read it, and have an accurate account of what happened in court. We had newspaper accounts prior to that, but we just had to rely on what reporters chose to emphasize and things like that. Now having the transcript, that was very important. And also the investigation, they exhumed Emmett Till's body for an autopsy and DNA testing, and confirmed that the body was him, although nobody really doubted that. But they had to confirm it in case there was another trial, because the identity of the body was what the defense used the first time around to help get the men acquitted. So they proved the body was Emmett Till, and they were able to do x-rays on his body to find more broken bones than they assumed he had. So we know more about his manner of death. They found the murder weapon and all of that. And I kind of thought maybe a lot of this stuff was going to be coming, because the power of the federal government to investigate this case the way they did for that year and a half, I knew there'd be more information and I'd have access to so much more stuff for my book. And that's exactly what happened. And so I was able to use all of that. And so the last few chapters of the book talk about the FBI investigation and the outcome of that from 2004 to 2007. And I went into a lot of detail about that. And so that's another unique thing about my book. Not only is it the first book to give a full comprehensive telling about the case and how it unfolded in 2004, in 1995, and 1955 and 1956, but it also gives the full story of what happened since then, right up to the end of the investigation in 2007. So, and I wanted to provide all that information for people because I thought it was essential to understand the case, to know how long the search for justice lasted, that it just didn't end with the acquittal in 1955, but that people like Emmett Till's mother and others kept pursuing justice, and it led, even though it didn't lead to justice, nobody was ever tried and convicted for Emmett Till's murder. We have a lot more information. We're much closer to knowing the truth, and sometimes that alone adds so much in the way of closure. It doesn't give you a complete closure, but it certainly takes as far as you can get for that. And that led to the Tallahatchie County officially apologizing for the trial and the acquittal in October of 2007. The Emmett Till Memorial Commission, which was a biracial commission, held an event in Sumner where at the courthouse where the trial took place, and apologized to the family, issued a proclamation, and erected a sign on the courthouse steps talking about how unjust the trial was. So that's the best we've gotten out of this. And I was able to write about all of that and tell this full important story. And that's one of the things I really like about the book. And I think that's one of the things that people have told me that they liked, that they were able to go and learn just the whole story from beginning to end. And so there are a few things that some of the challenges in writing the book, as I said, determining what the facts were when there were so many contradictory stories, either from people's memory or sometimes, people who were at the store and witnessed the incident between Emmett and Carolyn Bryant told different versions. Not so much at the time, but later on when they spoke for the first time, we get a story that just seems to come out of nowhere, and had to determine if those were correct. But what in the process of doing all of that, as I found other documents that and things like that that could help me feel confident about the direction I was going, and about the to feel comfortable and confident to say this is what happened, and not say it tentatively, but to say this is really definitely what happened, because we have so many corroborating stories. Sometimes in the process, I had to contradict people I didn't want to contradict. And often it wasn't over major things, but sometimes it was. For example, Emmett Till's mother in the 50s, she gave several speeches right after the trial. So this was still fresh in her mind. She gave speeches, and some of those speeches were recorded, plus she gave interviews. And then in early 1956, she gave an 8-part interview to a woman named Ethel Payne, who worked for the Chicago Defender, the black newspaper in Chicago. And for my book, I take what she says there about Emmett's upbringing, about her marriage to Emmett's father, about the trip to Mississippi, about her hearing about the kidnapping and murder, and about her going to the funeral home to identify her son's body. And she says this on the witness stand too during the trial, some of this. So I took all of that information to kind of create what I feel is the most accurate account of all of those things I just mentioned. In her memoir that was published in 2003, which was published posthumously, she was alive for much of the research, or her co-author interviewed her, and they had some documents they were able to use, but much of it just came from her memory. And then when she died, her co-author had to rely on what he could gather from whatever sources she had. So that ended up causing some errors in the book. I think I found 17 places where what she says in her memoir doesn't gel with what she said in the 50s. So one of these things was when she went to the funeral home to identify Emmett's body. You may have seen her in documentaries talk about it, but I feel like what she said in her speeches in the 50s is likely the more accurate version. And that's the one that I think is so powerful. Thought I'd read a little bit of that. It's kind of graphic, but keep in mind, this comes from a speech she gave, and she was giving all of this graphic stuff to people as they listened to her in churches in up north. It'll take me just a second to find it probably in here because I forgot to mark it. But while I'm looking for it, if anybody, or maybe you prefer to wait. I was going to say someone has a question, or while I'm looking, then we're not sitting here in silence. It'll just take me a few moments.
Yeah, I have a question for you while you do that. So did you have any difficulty talking to some people? Did you experience some people who are unwilling to discuss the case? You yourself?
Yeah, people like Carolyn Bryant, I reached out. I never talked to her direct. She never even talked to me directly to say that she wouldn't talk to me. She just ignored my phone calls and letters. And then I wrote her daughter-in-law, because she was living with her by then, with her son and daughter-in-law. And her daughter-in-law is kind of the one who handles people when they call. Her son doesn't. He kind of leaves it to his wife to do. And so she was a difficult one. But then there were some friendly sources that just didn't want to talk because they said it was just too painful to revisit. And so they just turned me down flat. A couple of people wanted a lot of money to talk, and they weren't ones that I thought were very central to the story. So I thought, well, there's no reason to pay them for a couple of little tidbits that might be useful. And so I didn't pursue those. But I was able to get Carolyn Bryant's sister to talk. In the book, in the footnotes, if you see a place where there's someone close to Carolyn, who I refer to as a source, she wanted in the book she didn't want her name to be in the book, but she died in March. And so now I feel I can talk about it publicly, that her sister Charlotte was my source for a lot of information about Carolyn. So, and she had never talked to anybody in all these years. She'd had a few reporters. A lot of people didn't know she was Carolyn's sister. She was a journalist. She had been a traffic judge, and she'd been an elected city councilwoman in her part of Mississippi. So she was well known in the Mississippi Delta, but a lot of people didn't know she was Carolyn Bryant's sister. And she didn't want to cause problems with her family or cause it to be an issue when she was campaigning for public office. So she never talked about it. The only people who knew she was her sister were her close friends. But I found out through Facebook who she was. And after a mutual friend assured her that I had good motives, I just wanted to understand Carolyn, and I wasn't trying to just go after her or embarrass her or any of that. She agreed to talk, because I was the only person she talked to in all those years. But she didn't want to be identified. And the same thing happened with one of J.W. Milam's relatives. I got one to talk to me who knew him, and that was hard. She wouldn't do it until after J.W.'s wife, Juanita, died in 2014, because she didn't want her to feel betrayed, I think, by talking to me. So once Juanita died, then this person talked. But there was one, Emmett Till's cousins, who was with him at the store, who I got a hold of him. I wrote him a letter. I didn't hear back. And then I called him, and he hung up on me, and he said, "Don't ever call me again." And he was sympathetic to Emmett's case. And so he wasn't related to the murderers. I can understand them not wanting to talk. But for some of these people, it was just still too hard. It was painful, and they just wanted it to go away. So
if I may ask you, what did the sister to Caroline say?
She didn't say anything that was really enlightening to the Till case. Well, it was kind of enlightening in a way, because she said that in all those years after the trial, she never brought it up again. Roy never talked about it. They never talked about it with family. It's like they just pushed it aside and tried to go on with their lives. And back then, before there was internet and they could just move to another community. And they did. They moved out of Mississippi for about 15 years. And when they moved back, he opened up another store, and they just slowly immersed themselves in their new community, and people left them alone. That could never happen today. But in the early 70s, when they moved back in 1973 to Ruralville, Mississippi, which wasn't that far from Money, just a neighboring county, he had a black clientele at his store. Some people knew who he was, most didn't, but nobody said anything. He never got bothered by people coming in his store and making threats, or he didn't have reporters coming until about 1985 for the 30th anniversary of the murder. Then people started reaching out a little bit, but he was able to go that first 30 years and just have people leave him alone. It's kind of hard to believe, really, because that couldn't happen today. It just wouldn't have. So there's one portion here. When Emmett's mother is identifying his body, I'll put some glasses on because I can't see super well here. The body came from Chicago, or from Mississippi to Chicago on a train. There's some photographs of her meeting the body at the train station. And then she goes to the funeral home, and there was a Jet magazine reporter, Simeon Booker, and also photographer who were waiting at the funeral home for her to come. And then she had to talk the undertaker, the mortician, into opening the casket for her. He refused at first because he had signed a thing saying that he wouldn't open the casket. But once she talked him into it, she went in to look at the body. And she says here, the first thing that greeted us when we walked into the parlor was a terrible odor. I think I'll carry that odor with me to my grave. This is what she said in a speech a few months later. What I saw looked like it came from out of space. It didn't look like anything that we could dream, imagine in a funny book or any place else. It just didn't look like it was for real. And so then she stood over the casket, and he had been in a body bag and he had no clothes on. So she viewed him at first like this. She first noticed a large gash in his forehead, which she assumed had been made with an axe. The mouth was open and the tongue was protruding. Then she says, quote, his lips were twisted and his teeth were bared, just like a snarling dog's. Then she saw the gunshot wound and she says, quote, I wonder why they wasted a bullet because surely it wasn't necessary, meaning they had beaten him so bad that he was dead by the time they shot him. I wonder why they wasted a bullet. Some features she recognized, such as the nose and the forehead, but one eye was missing, which may have been lost during the embalming process because they did soak his body in embalming fluid because they couldn't embalm him intravenously like you normally do because his body was too bloated. They couldn't do it that way, so they just made some incisions in the body and put him in a tub full of embalming fluid. And but the other eye, she said, I found that she recognized the color of the other eye. And she said, quote, I found that part of the ear was gone and the entire back of the head had been knocked out. Then she asked if she wanted to see the other side of his body. So the mortician agreed to take the body out of the casket and put him on a slab. She sent some clothes back and then they dressed the body. And so while she was gone, the jet photographer took a picture of him. And that was David Jackson. And while he was doing that, he watched them take the body out of the casket onto the slab. He said while he did that, David Jackson was horrified to see a piece of Till's skull fall off and bits of his brains come out. Then he said, quote, calmly, Dave replaced the skull just like putting on a hat. So this job of Black reporters and photographers during this period was a very sad one because they had to document all of these things happening by photographing them and reporting on them. So they'd seen pretty much everything by this point, but they hadn't seen anything like this. This was truly the most gruesome murder they had ever come across. And so when Mamie came back an hour or so later, they saw that her son now was clothed while he was on the slab, but she saw the left side of his face for the first time. Quote, it looked as if somebody had taken a crisscross knife and gone insane. It was beaten into a pulp. So she said this as this was fresh on her mind just weeks after seeing this. And so it's a lot different than her later memory, although her later memory is very compelling and hard to listen to as well. This is a mother talking about her son just weeks after she witnesses this. And so I wanted to use these earliest sources to document this book because overall they're the most compelling and I believe are the most accurate. That's just one example of several in here where I rely on the earliest sources I can, and where later sources corroborate that, I felt safe, but where they contradicted, I had to research further and make the determination of which was the most accurate. And in this case, and in most cases, it was what they said in weeks after the murder that I tended to go with. So that's part of what makes the book important to me and accurate, because we're really taken back to the time this first unfolded. And I think that's an important thing to look at. I think the voices of the 50s who are deeply grieving and deeply mourning, and this is all just unfolding, those voices at the time, I think are the most compelling. So now I'm not sure how long I've gone now. Do we need to switch gears here and go to Q&A? Do you have other stuff about the book other aspects about the book first, or?
Yeah, we'll go to the Q&A, and then if we have time, we can discuss other aspects of the book. So there is so many questions one can come up with, obviously, so many. Like you said, I also came across this story in the documentary called Eyes on Prize. And even then in high school, it was a sad, sad story. So many questions. I'll ask you one or two, and then I open the floor for other people.
Okay.
For example, do we know the feelings of Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam's relatives? What do they think of the whole thing?
Well, these guys were brothers, half brothers, but the two families, the Bryants and the Milams, really didn't stay close. And I think part of it was because of the Till case. Each side kind of blamed the other for the murder. I know Roy Bryant's family believes that Milam was the driving force behind the killing, and that he was the real guilty one, that Emmett never would have been killed if it hadn't been for Milam pushing for it. But all they have to do is read what Roy said in 1985 when he was being tape recorded by a friend as he took him around to the different sites of the Till murder. He told his friend, and this is on tape, that we were just going to whip him and beat him up, but we'd been drinking and things got out of hand, and we went too far, and we were going to take him to the hospital, but a hospital wouldn't have done any good, so we threw his ass in the river. And he laughed as he said that. So there's clearly no remorse on his part. He was clearly involved in the murder as much as his brother. But the family, I think, because they want to cling to this idea that Milam did it, that they think Roy is either not guilty or not as guilty, or just a tag along, on something like that. The Milams, I think, they know full well that their father and grandfather committed this crime. And I think they just have learned to live with it and be embarrassed by it. The person I talked to in the family who has that last name of Milam told me she's had to live her whole life with people, with that name, and people asking if she's related, and then having to tell them, either deny it or tell them what the relationship was. But something that just kind of haunted the Milam family. I think it's haunted the Bryants too, but they've kind of deluded themselves into thinking it was Milam's fault. Carolyn Bryant and Juanita Milam, the two wives of the men tried, they didn't stay friends very long. And the last they saw each other was at the funeral of one of the Milam brothers, which I think was in the 90s. And they got into a bit of a fight there over blame on the Till murder, and Juanita Milam stormed out of the funeral. And so that's what the relative told me anyway. And so as far as remorse from Milam and Bryant, they never seem to show any. As far as their families, they've never made an attempt to reach out to the Till family to apologize. And they haven't really shown publicly, at least, any regret over what their father, grandfathers did. And they seem to have just, I think to some degree, they're bitter over having had to live with it. Maybe bitter about people approaching them, asking them about it, having to reporters call or come by the house. And they might be using that bitterness to say, well, if that's how people are going to treat us, then fine. And then that may have been why they lost any sympathy for Emmett Till. But I think some of the younger generation, at least on the Milam side, has some sympathy for Emmett. I'm not sure about the Bryants. The Milams are liberal politically, and they seem to have a bit of a concern for these issues, where the Bryants, I don't believe, do.
Yeah. So one more question, and then I let the other people ask questions. And this is something I want to hear your take. When I myself, and I'm sure a lot of other people, read aspects of even our own history, any country, any culture, that are difficult, where bad things were done, I sometimes ask myself, and this is what I am asking you, what do the relatives of those people or the descendants of those people, do they owe anything to the current generation? Do they, or is this done by those particular two people and nobody else? What are your thoughts?
Well, I've always felt that if the Bryant family or the Milam family were to reach out to the Till family, or just to speak publicly to America and say, we regret this, this was wrong, our grandfather was wrong, this kind of thing is wrong, and we need to band together and stop it. If they were to apologize, or if you have to just acknowledge that they were wrong, and I'm sorry, and I want to tell the Till family that, you know, you have our sympathies, that kind of thing would go a long way. I think we see a lot of hearts soften, not only with the Till family, but with others as well. This silence, this generational silence. When there's silence, you don't know what people are thinking, and you don't know what people are saying, you know, privately. And so you usually think the worst. Just like in relationships, if communication breaks down, there's a lack of trust. There's suspicion over anything someone does sometimes. And I think that's the same thing we see here. And all it would take was for these families to reach out, and a lot of that buildup and suppressed feelings, whether it's anger, whether it's hurt, whether it's just this continuous grieving, would start to melt a little bit. You know, like I said, there's no closure because Emmett's gone and no one was ever convicted. But we don't always need the courts to make a difference at a human level, and we can do that. And it's just right there waiting to be done, and no one's doing it. And whether it's this case or whether it's others, you know, I think it's a missed opportunity, and it takes little effort. It takes some humility. It takes some willingness to be maybe misunderstood by some people who feel like you're a traitor all of a sudden or whatever, but it's worth it, you know, because that can go a long way. And I would love to see that done. Emmett's mother told me that she always wanted to sit down with Carolyn Bryant and just talk mother to mother. She wasn't going to yell at her or chastise her or call the police on her or attack her or anything like that. She just wanted to talk mother to mother. And she didn't have any hatred in her heart. She let that go because she couldn't have lived her life the way she wanted to live it if she was consumed by hate. But it would have really been beneficial for Carolyn to take advantage of that moment. Her life from that moment on would have been totally different had she sat down with Emmett's mother. It would have been a hard thing to do, but the next 30, 40 years of her life would have been a lot better.
Yeah, you're right. When people are quiet, the other people assume the worst of those people who are quiet. They think sometimes perhaps you may share the same mindset as those two people who did it. So I want to give this chance to other people with a question. Anybody with a question, raise your hand so we can do it. Any question?
Yeah. Hello.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Joseph.
Yes. Yes. My name is JN. Mr. Anderson, thank you very much for coming to our book club.
Thanks for having me.
And I'm thinking, when you're talking about this so sad case, every time you hear this case, you know, you hear a different thing. And you think of, you know, you widen your scope in understanding this so gruesome murder. Now, beyond these individual cases, there is a deep south in this country that is full of so many thousands and thousands of such murders, sanctioned by the community, sometimes the local government. And you can see the jury goes there, hears the case and acquits people outright.
Yep.
I wonder, in your research, what you thought about the toll it takes on the perpetrators, not the victims, the perpetrators, the psychological toll it takes, and what you think today now of the discussion that is going on the critical race theory, and how relevant it is to our understanding of that past.
Well, on that, we'll start with the what the effect this stuff has on the perpetrators, because I think we see, in these cases, because people are used to being acquitted so often, and we have an occasional conviction, like we've had with the killer of George Floyd and with the killer of Ahmaud Arbery. We've seen it just in the last few months, those cases where those killers, have sworn they were innocent, felt it was justified, and for how they convince themselves of that, no one wants to think of themselves as a murderer. And so our minds are capable of justifying stuff, and then we become embittered when it doesn't go our way, and that bitterness sometimes is used to convince us further that we were right. And so it's a lot of psychological stuff going on to kill someone. In your mind, you pretty much have to justify it, or you're unless you have some penitence in there, then you'll admit you did it and then start the road towards healing that way. Most people don't do that, and so they have to find some way to justify it. What's really troubling to me, in addition to that, is when it has community support, when these crimes have community support. In Emmett Till's case, there was a sympathy for him in Mississippi for the first couple of days, but once people started seeing in the South that the Northern press was talking about Mississippi, was what they felt the Northern press and the NAACP were trying to interfere. They felt that this was going to be the end of segregation if these two men are convicted, that it would be a slippery slope, a domino effect. And so for them, it was more important that these men get acquitted, even though people knew they killed Emmett Till, but that didn't matter. They just needed them acquitted, because if they were convicted, then what would be next? There'd be the end of segregation, or there'd be interracial dating, there'd be this and there'd be that. A lot of the people who wrote letters to the judge and the attorneys pleading for an acquittal, it wasn't because the men were innocent. They said, if we lose this one, then it's open season on white women in the South, and blacks, and they didn't call them blacks, they used the N-word, but saying they'll come down here and cause all kinds of problems. So community support is what got them through, and why they felt they could live in Mississippi or continue their lives. And we see that today. How many times, like with this Arbery case, how long it took them to even be arrested, because people believed them that it was self-defense until the video went viral. They had the DA who wouldn't arrest them. And so when people kill someone and videotape it, or in the Milam Bryant's case, they kill Emmett Till and they go home and go to bed just like it was nothing. Part of the reason they could do that is because they felt they had the community behind them. And so that's really disturbing to me, because you're taking people who didn't commit it, who suddenly are culpable in some way because you're supporting them. And that's not a thing of the past. That's not something from the 50s and 60s. That's something that we still see today. And that's scary. Until we defeat that, people will feel like they're entitled to take someone's life when they think they can get away with it, because they get away with it when they have community support. Now, as far as critical race theory, this battle is so interesting because, first of all, they're creating a monster that doesn't exist when they're saying how this is being done in K through 12 schools, and that kids are being taught to hate each other and this and that. That's a far right myth to scare people, and to create this, just creating this whole idea and blowing it up and creating this monster that doesn't exist. But teaching critical race theory and the idea behind it, of how racism is so deeply rooted in our country, that's important that we learn, and we can't be in denial about that. And so we have to get rid of the myths about critical race theory and teach the truth about it and what it's trying to really accomplish, because we can't understand our history without fully, when you think about it, it's called the 1619 Project, because in 1619, the first slaves were brought over here. It was another 245 years after that we even, ended the Civil War. So it had this long, lengthy history. And then after the Civil War, I think some people just thought, well, who look at history think that, well, slavery ended in 1865, so everything's been just fine for Black people ever since then. You know, look at what happened with Reconstruction and the backlash to Reconstruction, how everything went, you know, the South was so determined to keep Black people living as slaves that they were able to write into their Constitution laws that kept them from being able to vote, even though the Constitution says they can vote. They use other stuff at the state level in the South, such as poll taxes and literacy tests and all of this that was designed to keep Black people from voting. So the next 100 years after slavery was the Jim Crow era, which was just as bad because, you know, kept people impoverished. That's when the era of lynching really began and went full force into the 20s and 30s. And so really, when you think of 1619 to the Voting Rights Acts in the mid 60s, you know, that was 340 years to really embed racism, racial attitudes, all this stuff that the states in the former Confederacy were able to still thrive living the way they lived for all those hundreds of years. And so we can't understand our history. How do you take all of that and just pretend it didn't happen? You can't move on from it until you really understand and deal with and wrestle with that past. And so it infuriates me because it's like they want to have their 340 years of all this stuff and then just say, well, that was then. Let's move. We have to move on. Why talk about that? Mm-hmm. But we don't approach other stuff that way. Why do we approach racism that way? It seems to get a pass in the minds of a lot of people. And so we have to drill that idea home to everybody that, you know, we're not teaching our racist past or admitting that racism is embedded into our society to stir up trouble. We're doing that so we can understand and really move on the way everybody wants to. But you can't until you've grappled with it and understand it.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Sam, your hand was up.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Anderson. Let me say, this is also not easy, just you narrating the whole story. My first question is, in 1955, when the incident happened, why didn't the FBI investigate? And then my second question is, can you describe the emotion, you know, when they drove the open casket, coffin open, and people were watching? Yeah. What was the, speaking to the family or the community organizers, what did they want to achieve? And it was a very emotional act to do. And did it move any needle? Was there any legislation that was, did the community react? Did the leaders, did the president do anything in that case? And then I was surprised during President Obama's term, not so much of this case was him being the first African-American president. Not so much of this case was pushed forward or anything happened like that. But I would also add that nothing this boy did, whether he whistled or not, ever justified what they did to him. And how does the family, how does that lady lives with it? It's knowing that you lied and caused such a gruesome death. And then the other thing is, can you educate us on the statute of limitation in regards to this this case? And also, is lynching outlawed, or is it in the process of being outlawed in America?
Okay, great questions. The first one with the FBI, at the time, there wasn't really a federal law that they could have used at the time for the to go after Milam and Bryant. Because they didn't kidnapping him, they didn't cross state lines and they kidnapped him. They couldn't use federal intervention to look into or prosecute for the kidnapping. The hate crime, I don't think there was a a federal hate crime law at the time, and whatever federal civil rights violations laws existed at the time, they were very weak. And so some people thought if they had used the Emmett Till case as a test case, it would have been, the man would have been acquitted, and then that would have kept that likely in a weakened state for decades to come. So I know the FBI, they looked into it and they found that there wasn't a way they could have entered. They really could have, though, had they tried a little harder, because Sheriff Strider, it was clear, and maybe it wasn't clear then, maybe they would have had a hard time proving it, but he had done some witness tampering by hiding witnesses in jail, and that would have, they could have intervened under color of law, is what it was called. And so they could have intervened could they have proven that Sir Sheriff Strider was interfering with witnesses and hiding them. But nobody was going to talk about that then. Everybody was on his side, so they would have had a very hard time investigating. In time, the laws that did change as a result, and it wasn't just Emmett Till, but the Civil Rights Act of 1957 was passed. It was the first Civil Rights Act since Reconstruction, I believe. And if you look at the trial of the congressional testimony, they cite the Emmett Till case several times in there as they argued for this, for and against. Even Southern politicians were using the Emmett Till case to argue against the bill. Northern politicians in Congress were arguing using Emmett Till's name to why the bill should be passed. And so the debate went on for a while, but the bill passed. And a lot of it was because they cited Emmett Till so much and referred to that case. It was still fresh on everybody's mind in 1957. So that law, to what extent it really influenced it, I think it did. But there were other factors involved too. Now, the other, you had a question about, okay, we did the FBI, we did the civil, you asked about if Carolyn Bryant, how she's lived with herself all the time. The thing you need to understand about Carolyn Bryant is the lie she told, and this is something I talk about in the book, and I'm in the process of writing an article because I think it's important that people know this. A lot of people don't want to believe it, but the lie she told isn't what got Emmett killed. The lie she told came after he was killed to help her husband be acquitted. That's the lie she told on the stand. Because when she tells this elaborate story on the stand on the witness stand about how Emmett grabbed her by the waist and propositioned her and jumped behind the counter and told her he'd had sex with white women before. When her husband and when JW and Roy came to Mose Wright's house, all Moses Wright heard them say over and over is, "We want the boy that did the talking and money, did the smart talk." And then and when they asked Emmett, "Are you the one who did the talking at money?" And he said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, get up, you're coming with us." Had they have thought he had tried to rape her in Mississippi South in the 50s, a black male being accused of rape for a white woman, they wouldn't have come in there asking for the boy who did the talk. They would have come in there asking for the boy that tried to rape Carolyn, and they would have been far more angrier than they were. And her September 2nd statement to her attorney, she doesn't give that lie. And so had she have told Roy and JW that Emmett tried to rape her, she wouldn't have walked that back for her attorney just 2 days later and then said it again on September 20th on the witness stand. So her lie didn't get Emmett killed. A lot of people say she lied, he died, and I've been seeing that online a lot. And that's just, there's no evidence for that. And I'm not defending her. I just want to get the facts out there because I think it's important that we know the order of things on this. So, but the lie came as a way because they wanted to make sure that a jury wouldn't convict her husband. And the best way to get a jury to sympathize in this case would have been to portray Emmett as a rapist. So the lie was concocted probably by the attorneys because Sidney Carleton, one of the attorneys, seemed to start pushing for that. He started telling the press a few days before the trial that, oh, she's going to tell a story how he grabbed her, he tussled with her, he did this and that. And it was clearly invented much later. And so, but she still had to live with lying, and she still had to live with what her husband did. When the FBI interviewed her in 2004, the FBI, and this is something the FBI agent told me, and also Carolyn's sister told me. So I got this story from both of them, which is very interesting. They corroborate each other. The FBI agent asked Carolyn, so in all these years, do you think about Mamie Till? And she started crying, and she said, of course I do. I'm a mother too. And she started crying. And her sister said when she left the interview, you could tell she'd been crying. Her sister told me that she'd been horrified by the murder all this time, which may be true, but she stayed silent all this time too. And when she knew people had questions, she knew the Till family wanted answers. So she ignored all of that. And maybe it scared her. Maybe she thought if she said something, somebody would go after her. I don't know. But she clearly was wrong to, if she was horrified by the murder, then she should have come forward and reached out to them and tried to at least do her part in easing their pain. And she chose not to do that. So that's been, I tried to tell when I wrote her a letter to first get her to talk to me, I said, I'm going to treat you fairly in the book, but Mamie Till has told me that she would just love to sit down with you mother to mother. Mamie was dead by then, but I said she wasn't angry at you. And if you could find it in your heart to come forward and talk to Till family members, they'll be glad to talk to you. They just want to sit and talk. And she just chose not to. And she's a very nervous person, a very private person. She gets scared at the drop of a hat over anything. So in a way I can kind of see it, but it's just a painful thing she should have dealt with. And then her life would have gone so much better. And she just didn't do it. And I wish she had, and I wish she still would, but she's not in the best of health right now. So I don't think that day will ever come. Did you have another question? I think I may have missed, I don't think I got to everything.
Not really a question. Statute of limitation. The family said they were not surprised by the outcome. They were not surprised by the outcome of the closing of the case. And also something else I would want to mention is not so many people know about this story, especially African Americans or immigrants. And very soon there's going to be a movie being made by some few celebrities. And I think that will highlight what really happened. It's a really gruesome story that the world would really want to know. And I'm sure when a lot of people know about this, not just the privileged few or whoever lives in the South, we may not be able to bring back the boy, but I believe hearts and minds will be changed.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. As far as the statute of limitations, for her lying, whether she lied at the trial, that was a 5-year statute of limitations, so that expired in 1960. Had they been able to prove she lied to the FBI in 2004, they had until 2009 to prove that. And so the statute of limitations on the lying part is long over. If she had any involvement in the murder as an accomplice or as, in some way, there's no statute of limitations on that. So if the evidence was there, they could still indict her for that. They tried in 2007, and they don't have any more evidence. Just if that lie doesn't come into the picture now, the evidence of her involvement is the same as it was in 2007, and a grand jury didn't indict her. It was a racially mixed jury that listened to the evidence. The evidence for manslaughter for her was pretty weak. Even if they had indicted her, the defense would have gotten her off pretty easily. There just wasn't enough to show that she was there willingly and that she wanted Emmett Till to die. And so technically, yeah, an indictment could have happened, but it wouldn't have ever gone any farther than that, I'm sure. So
let me ask you another maybe personal question. If there was money on one side or the other, could it have changed anything? Assume like they had the best lawyers ever. Could it have changed anything? Because we've seen this in other trials. Like if you have money or a better lawyer, the outcome is better compared to. And how was the financial position of the boys' family? Were they well off? Were they?
Of
Did they have
of who, the Bryant family,
yeah. No, not the Brian the other family.
the Milams, or
Emmett.
Emmett's family.
Emmett's family. Oh, well, his mother had a good job in Chicago. She worked for the Air Force, but she made the equivalent of what would be about 40,000 today. So, not a lot, but they weren't impoverished. And her mother and stepfather had money, so they could have probably helped out. But, and I'm not sure, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not sure how this would work. But since the state that was prosecuting, do they have to just use the state prosecutors, the district attorney's office with their own attorneys? They couldn't have tried the case, right? I don't think a private attorney can. I think you have to be tried by the state attorneys. The defense could have, the defense hired attorneys, but I don't know that they could have, at least in trying the case. They may have been able to have attorneys that could have helped investigate.
But by the way, the prosecutor made a curious statement there. He said that the worst the boy should have been given is a beating.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is very telling.
Yeah, I know a couple times he talked about having to cater the jury once in a while, but the jury, like, he couldn't call it till Mrs. Or her name was Bradley then, that he couldn't call her Mrs. Bradley because the jury would have, the custom in the South was to call black men and women either by their first name or uncle or aunt. And so he had to cater to some stuff. But that's the thing, the defense or the prosecutor, even if he wanted, if he was sincere in wanting to secure a murder conviction, I'm 100% sure that he was still in favor of segregation. So he would have had racial tendencies on his own. He may not have lynched a black person, or he may not have mistreated one, but he drew the line too, somewhere along that racial spectrum. And so, yeah, to get a prosecutor who would have been free from any racial bias would have been impossible at the time. And so they had that going against them that whole time.
Yeah, I'm looking at the clock here and we are out of time, but I want to make sure we cover all the questions. Anybody else with a question or comment? Anything to Mr. Anderson, or comment about the case? And let me ask you while I wait for someone to raise their hand. You mentioned the documentary Eyes on the Prize, which I have watched, and I'm hoping everyone here has watched. And we can, if you want to, you can see hundreds and thousands of hours of people who were active in the civil rights movement. But everybody you see interviewed today or later is always people who were on the side of civil rights. Do we have recollections, recorded recollections, or extensive recollections of people who were on the opposite side?
Yeah, there are some. I think in the Eyes on the Prize, they even interviewed the founder of the Citizens Councils, or someone who was high up in the Citizens Council, and they were giving a perspective, in the late 70s, which would have been that terribly long after. It's interesting when a couple of the newspaper editors that I interviewed for the Teal book, they've passed on now, but I interviewed him about 12 years ago. One, his name was Dub Shoemaker. He wrote for the Jackson Daily News. And when I asked him about all this stuff, he was taking his present day perspective and putting that on himself in the 50s, saying that he was never for segregation. He was never for the acquittal of the men or any of that. But when you see his articles from the 50s, he clearly seemed to side with the segregationists at the time and the pro Jim Crow people. So some of these people, you interview them years later, even if they've changed perspective to some degree, they read that into their past, like that's how they always felt. And so you have to deal with that. Sometimes you get people who still hold to certain views that they had once upon a time. And it's kind of telling, it's kind of jarring when you hear them admit that, that kind of stuff. I didn't interview, but I went into my first time to Mississippi in 2005. I went into a little store. I was trying to find money, and it was hard to find it back then because it didn't have GPS, and it wasn't even hardly on the map. And when she asked me what I was going there for, I told her, and right away she started saying, "Why won't people leave that case alone? You know, that boy did more than whistle. Then he started talking about how he grabbed Carolyn and this and that. But she kept trying to say he shouldn't have been killed. But then she'd go on to all this stuff about how bad Emmett Till was. Then he shouldn't have been killed. But she would go back and forth. So a lot of these people hold to those views that they try to temper them a little bit when they talk to you. But to talk to them privately, I think we'd be shocked at some of the stuff we'd hear. But getting those people to say that on camera, you know, they would still do it in the 70s and maybe in the 80s. I think it'd be hard to find anybody today who would still admit to that. But there's probably footage in the post-civil rights era of people still holding to those views on tape. But it'd be interesting to find. It'd be interesting to compile all of that. People who belong to the citizens councils in the 50s and 60s, the ones who are still alive, my guess is that they still hold to those views pretty well.
And it's very scary that there is someone who holds views that are somewhat close to J.W. Milam today.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Alive, and Roy would be, you know, he was born in 31, so he'd be 90. So he could still, someone like him could still be alive. And you know what he'd be saying if he was alive.
Or his younger siblings would be like 70s or 80s. So they would still be alive today.
Yeah.
All right. Any other question? We need to close the meeting for today. Any other question? Any comment? I would like to know, why did they change the casket? Why was it changed? Because the original one is in the Smithsonian. So why did they do that?
Oh, because when they exhumed his body in 2005, when people do that, they traditionally always bury the person in a new casket, because it can be resealed, and I think the family feels better to put them in something new that they can seal up and protect from the elements, because I don't think you can do it as easily if you open it. And so that's why that one is there. And so, and that's in a very popular room. And have you been to the?
I like to do this.
Okay, fine.
Correct. Yes.
So yeah, and I'm so glad it's there. It's helped people learn about this case. Millions of people have filed by that casket now, just like they did in the 50s. And people know Emmett Till now because of that. So that casket and that open casket funeral is really still influencing people today.
All right. Anybody else? I would like to ask Sam to say a word of thanks to the author and officially to close the meeting.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Can I say one last little thing?
Yes.
You mentioned the film coming up. There are two. There's one that's going to be on television starting January 6th.
Something
Yes.
like, oh, shoot. Okay.
Miniseries. That's the one that's based on my book.
Oh, very good. Mhm.
And if you watch closely at the jurors in hours 4, 5, and 6, you'll see me. I played a juror in this. So
What's the name of the movie?
because I play someone who helped acquit these guys, but I wanted to be in the courtroom because they used the original courtroom in Sumner, Mississippi to reshoot these trial scenes. And it was very surreal being there and seeing this trial unfold in that very room. And I wanted to be there and see it. And so I got to play a juror for that reason. And so you'll see me. And then in the fall, there's a theatrical film coming out. Whoopi Goldberg is in it. She plays Emmett's grandmother. And that one's going to be in theaters. It'll be a 2-hour movie. So in 2022, you'll have Emmett Till will be in the news a lot. People are going to be talking about Emmett like crazy because January, the 6.5 hours limited series, and it'll stream on Hulu right after. And then in the fall, the theatrical film called Till. So there's a lot to look forward to in 22 to learn about this case and to educate people.
Thank you very much. What's the name of your movie? Is it the one with Jay-Z and Will Smith, or it's something else?
Women of the Movement. So look for Thursday, January 6th at 8 p.m. your time. I believe it's 8 to 10 in the Eastern time. And then it'll stream on Hulu the next day. If you watch it the next day, you don't have to worry about commercials.
Oh, very good. In closing, wow, it's just a sad story, part of history. And I'm not very sure much has changed. I know it sounds disappointing. I'm not very sure much has changed. If we were to switch races, if it was if it was a white dude working in a restaurant and a black guy, I believe the outcome would have been different. But unfortunately, these are some of the things we have to live with. But we should be hopeful with a lot of publicity and a lot of people getting educated. Things will slowly, and you guys producing movies that will create emotions and touch the lives and minds of people. I believe people's perspectives will be changed, and we may not change much, but perhaps an apology from whoever did wrong would go a long way to the family. And it's not just healing the community. It's not just healing that will take place in terms of like the mother and the family, but also the community and years of segregation. I'm not very sure whether lynching is still going on in the South or whether it was outlawed.
Your question about whether it's a crime or they've passed in the House to make it the House of Representatives to make it a federal crime. I don't think it's gone to the Senate yet, or they haven't voted on it yet. But that would make lynching a federal crime, and so that would be very important. They've been trying to do that for decades and decades, and we seem closer than ever. But it still hasn't been. Biden will sign it for sure if it passes in the Senate. So.
Correct. But I'm also still curious why the DOJ was quick to close the case. But
they opened in 2017, so it took 4 years.
It took 4 years, okay.
Just to try to evaluate what she said or didn't say to this historian, and I'm sure they had other stuff they were looking at too. But it was a 4-year attempt to try to get something here, and it just didn't work. So.
Okay, yeah. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much, Devery Anderson. That was very enlightening. And I wish we'd have you more often. Daniel would organize. And can you share a link of where we can buy the book? So that when the movie comes out, we compare the two. We see which one is more closer.
Anybody who would like the book and would like a signed copy, I can order them from the publisher, and then they'll come to me. I can sign it and send it on to you. It'd be like $28 for shipping and everything. That's generally what I charge when I get them. And if you want to write me, if you're interested, you can do it through PayPal or send me a check or Venmo or whatever you'd like to do. And I can order copies anytime. And so that's if you'd like a signed one. Other than that, you can just go to.
I think I would want that. I want that. I'll follow
up with Daniel. Daniel can follow up with you and
email address with any of you.
Okay.
And thank you very much. And this is not the regular book you read. This is a book with emotions. This is a movie with emotions. And
it is. It was hard to write. It's been hard for people to read, but that education is important.
Correct.
And when you talked about how we need to be educated, when people ask me if things are getting better, I always say, listen, I'm a white guy who can walk into a store. I never think about anybody following me around. I don't think about anything when a cop stops me. I said, don't ask me if things are getting better. We need to listen to people who live racism, and we need to defer to what they tell us. I can't take what I don't experience and then claim things are better. People who live it and experience are the ones we need to listen to. And so we need to be educated by the Black community and listen to their stories and believe. That's my obligation. And it's every white person's obligation to listen and believe. And then do something to change it.
Correct. Yeah. Daniel, are you still there?
Yes.
I think we've covered everything.
Yes.
Unless Mr. Kariuki, you want to say a last word or anything?
No, I just say I always admire people from the white community who take on our struggle and help. And it goes a long way, and it is very encouraging. And I just thank you as a human being. I think that is what we are supposed to be. And you are an example of what one would want to be now, and even encourage our children to be that. And if we have enough of you, this country would change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. It was great to meet you all. And hopefully you want to have me back at some point after the show airs, or if you want to talk further about anything, I'd be happy to join you anytime. So.
Yeah, we definitely need to talk about BLM. We need to talk about a whole lot of other topics that are very relevant today. As you said, this did not just end in the 60s. No, the results of what happened are still with us today. Thank you very much.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you. Great to meet you all.